And welcome to another edition of the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by Jackie Augustine. We are here in the FingerLakes1.com studio, and man, it is warm. Summer's here.
Yes, it certainly is.
Wow.
Happy summer. I am not going to complain because anytime I'm feeling too warm, I just think about long, cold, windy days, and I think I will just enjoy this.
So, obviously, summer being here, I think a lot of people tend to assume that politics gets less crazy in the summer. But maybe we found some stories in the last couple weeks, 3 weeks since we've been on, that break that trend and really show people that just because it's summer, just because the meetings are less interesting or maybe seem less interesting, there's still plenty going on.
Yeah, I think in the summertime, it's always, I think attendance at meetings is lower, so any bad things that might be on the agenda are going to be pushed through in the summertime when not as many people are looking. I don't mean that to sound so cynical, but I've just found summertime is not really a time that nothing goes on. Like last year, that's when the city council went ahead and was going to sell part of the Lake View parcel down by the state park. So you can't take your eyes off this operation for a minute.
So we've got, obviously it has been 3 or 4 weeks since we've last been here. So we've got some questions from those who've been following along, reading on FingerLakes1.com, picking up local newspapers. First one comes from Anna in Seneca Falls, who asks, where does the town of Seneca Falls' audit by New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli's office stand? There hasn't been a lot of front page reporting about this, just sort of some background reporting that everyone knows that an audit has been taking place since last fall. It does look like we're getting closer-ish to a resolution or an outcome, but at this point, we still don't know what that means, right? So we know that once the audit is complete, there's going to be, the expectation is 2 or 3 reports that are released. Likely a findings, likely a pathway forward for the town of Seneca Falls to correct some of the outstanding issues, and then perhaps some sort of more expedient report that sort of summarizes everything. At least that's what we've been led to believe. But I will say this, the idea or the conventional wisdom was that the audit was coming to a close and the auditors had left the town of Seneca Falls a couple weeks ago. Now, some newer developments, one of which we're going to talk about later in the program, have actually caused parts of the audit to be reopened up or to be, shouldn't say reopened up because I don't think it was ever closed, but for a little more digging to be done.
Right.
So that's where it stands right now. As far as I know, this is really the question everybody has. When's it going to be over? When are we going to see the results? Everybody wants to know what the outcome is. And to that, I've cautioned everyone to just take a step back and think about the scope at which the auditors are trying to reach. They're going through years of information, years of data that frankly hasn't been handled appropriately in a community, in a municipal scenario where checks and balances and procedures and protocol, it's not that they've been violated, they just didn't exist.
Yeah, I'd say they're irregular.
Right. Well, in some cases, it's been very black and white where we have gotten reports from different individuals within the municipal structure that say policies did not exist, like in certain areas. So that's the kind of mess that the town is going to be left cleaning up, and that's also the mess that the auditors now have had to sift through for months and months and months.
Right. And you never quite know what they're focusing on, because I remember many, many years ago when Geneva it was not even a comprehensive audit by the state comptroller, it was a more targeted audit. And that ended up releasing a report about computer use policies that showed a couple of counselors who had been using city-issued computers, and a few employees had been, including our economic development director, not the current one. No, we don't currently have an economic development director, but had been like online shopping and just doing stuff on company time or with city equipment that they should not have been doing. And that it was interesting because I remember on city council being told, oh, there's an audit, and thinking we were going to get some really in-depth financial review, and instead we didn't know that they were kind of focusing on this other piece, which was equally interesting, equally enlightening, and hopefully resulted in some changes that are still on the books. But so you kind of never know what they're going to dig into and see as the key issues.
And I think that's one of the really cool things is that they essentially are able to go in there with no real constraints,
right,
and dig into everything fully in a way that isn't sort of challenged by, one person's idea about what the problem is, But certainly that'll be something that we continue to talk about. We may even end up taking an entire episode to sort of dive into that report when those reports become public. But until then, it's still, unfortunately, a lot of sitting and waiting. Ellis from Ithaca asks, since Tracy Matrano won last month's primary to take on Congressman Tom Reed, how confident do you guys feel that she can beat him in the fall? Ooh.
Well, I am not good at predictions, so
prognostication is
yes, that is
suit?
not my strong suit. So I don't know. I mean, I think that her campaign has been impressive in terms of understanding what the issues are and getting backing from a wide range of people. I think Tom Reed has one and only one kind of counterattack, which is this extreme Ithaca liberal, which doesn't fit her by geography or philosophy. So I'm not sure. I think he's just going to go with it because they don't really have anything else. Right. But I feel like anybody who's paying attention would understand how troubled Tom Reed is in terms of representing this district. So I think it's really just a message of how informed people are and if they're paying attention and if they're going to vote in their best interests or if they're just going to vote party line because they feel like it. You never know. You never know what people will do. Not everybody is rational.
And I think that becomes my basis for where I feel like this whole race sort of stands is, can Tracy Matrano, or for that matter, any Democratic candidate, win over enough of the difference, which is the middle of the road voters and some Republicans, because the bottom line is that some will have to convert in order to actually win the race. Is that feasible? Is it doable? I think it's tough. Obviously, you never know what can happen between now and then. You could get a couple rough news cycles, and it can close up an otherwise wide margin. And then, of course, you look at polling, and I think back to the beginnings of Cynthia Nixon's announced campaign, and how wide how wide the margin was then, but how quickly it shrunk up after some good timing and good press. So it could go either way. I've heard some people talking about, it's likely going to be a 60-40 split.
Yeah.
Man, I would be surprised by that, just given the perceived momentum that Democrats seem to have.
Right. And I mean, the tariffs, people need to understand this stuff affects our neighbors here within this congressional district. There are people who are going to suffer negative economic effects from the current administration's apparent misunderstanding of key issues and policies that are damaging. So Tom Reed has really doubled down, so people are going to have to ask themselves, if they're Republicans, is that really the party of sensible fiscal conservatism anymore, or is it just the party of Trump? If it's the party of Trump, Reed is going to win hands down. But if people who are registered Republicans are principled, I think they could be much closer.
It's interesting because I think the biggest roadblock for either side is getting people who live in small rural communities to understand that, these big, wide, seemingly massive issues that cross seas
Right.
actually matter to them.
Yep.
Tariffs are really complicated. Tariffs are something that people who live in, Bristol or some other small communities, Ovid, frankly, they just don't care about. They care about the property taxes much more than they care about that.
Right.
So I guess messaging will probably be the biggest factor on that. And then our third question comes from Sean in Waterloo. After the recent tragedy in Waterloo, are our local communities really safe anymore, or is the system too broken? Okay, so for those who might not have known or seen the headlines, obviously, double fatal shooting last week in Waterloo, the type of crime and tragedy that frankly just doesn't happen very often, maybe once every couple decades in a community like Waterloo. I wrote my column in the Finger Lakes Times, which will be published tomorrow, about this, and I think it really, for me, comes down to a couple points. One, the system, yes, it may be broken to some degree. There may be some flaws in the system, but I don't think that trumps the point that we need to be very careful about how we approach it and understand that, one, people are what make up that system, and two, there are many, 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 many areas that need work in order to make the system functional or to fix what might have been broken.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible situation, and I think there are a lot of things I feel like I could say about this, including how people who have a history of violent or sexual offenses are treated in terms of how lenient their release or supervision, post-release supervision might be. But I don't want to completely color the discussion by my past experience. But I will say, in general, I think, and maybe this is a positive outcome of the Me Too movement that would have a local, tangible, local, immediate impact, would be that in New York State, the threshold for people getting a restraining order or getting some kind of request for protective custody or a variety of protections is, I think, pretty high. You kind of have to have suffered a direct offense before you can get protection against a future offense. And I think that maybe a message here overall is that we should be listening to people who've been victimized and take that more seriously immediately. So instead of the burden having to be on the person who feels threatened, although I understand there is a burden, you want to protect everybody's rights, I think we need to take people's statements that they feel in danger by someone else, or if they have text messages or they have emails or people have witnessed an altercation. I think there needs to be the ability to take that really seriously in determining how we respond to the people who are doing those things.
Yeah, and I think even if it just starts with, when there is an established pattern, which there seems to have been an established pattern here, taking those circumstances more seriously and having better safeguards in place to protect the people who are at risk in those situations.
Right.
Really seems like the place where it has to start. But then you start getting into bail and you start getting into all these different parts, moving parts at that make it really complicated to address this system. I know a lot of people, when they say that, they've sort of reached max frustration. They're so fed up with it that they just want to see this fix that takes care of all of it, and it just isn't possible.
Well, it's not easy and it's not quick. I think we could approach something that gets it right. I just don't think we're there yet. So I agree with you. Nothing's going to be perfect, but there are certainly changes that could be made to take. And I don't mean to say it's only women who suffer these types of offenses, and that was not the case in Waterloo. But I think that there is a pattern and a history of not taking women's concerns about domestic violence and threats as seriously sometimes. So I do think that needs to change. And I'm not saying that I am not trying to second guess anything in this particular case. I don't know enough about it. I'm just saying that when there is a tension on an issue like this, it's a good time to talk about the whole range of things that are going on related to this kind of violence.
So our first topic, and I'm sure that's going to be something that we sort of break down further. We're hearing reports that family members are actually going through the process of trying to create some legislation and working with legislators at the state level to create a better system, I guess would be the right way to frame that. But there again, that still isn't a guarantee,
right?
Given what we've seen with, I'll use it as an example, Brittany's Law.
Right.
8 times passed in Senate, but unfortunately can't get a vote in Assembly, and would, in theory, work to help better the system, but can't get across the finish line. First topic of the day, though, real topic that we break down here, no to Crestwood.
Yes. Hooray!
So the state's top environmental regulator on Thursday halted a controversial gas storage project proposed for the caverns next to Seneca Lake, ending a fierce 8-year battle between Midwestern fossil fuel interests and local residents and businesses.
Yep.
There was a lengthy 29-page statement released by Basil Segos after the actual decision was made.
I have to say I didn't read it.
29 pages, not many people would read it. Basically, the argument was that it simply does not. There were concerns about the caverns, one, but also that it didn't really fit with what the Finger Lakes is. And
I did read part of that.
Unsurprisingly, it's a no-brainer at this point. The incinerator should be tossed right in that same category.
Yeah, absolutely.
But a lot of people were surprised about the timing. Were you?
Yeah, well, I think it's great. And I just think it shows the way in which a community that is persistent, creative, dedicated, can actually, win. Because there were so many angles, so many fronts of this battle against this permit that I think all groups, no one group can claim that this was the reason it happened, because you had the We Are Seneca Lake people who were down getting arrested, which raised the consciousness of the entire area about what's going on. That was so excellent. You had the Seneca Lake Guardian group that was engaging. Now I'm terrible with names, but anyway, the National Resources Defense Council that was representing the municipalities. You had the municipalities who were able to get these resolutions passed, did the press releases, and then crafting the argument that showed in our own comprehensive plans and other municipal Finger Lakes economic development strategies that this was inconsistent. And all of that, plus, you had all the lobbying in Albany that just by regular residents, not paid lobbyists, all of it shows how it was, I don't know, it's a lesson in how to get people aware of what's going on, how to get the message across, and how to keep the pressure on in a way that wins. So
don't give up.
It's exciting.
Don't give up seems to be the big calling card of the whole thing. 8 years is a long time to be fighting one battle.
Yeah.
And he did it.
Yep.
I do think it's I'm surprised that it happened now, that the decision came now, and it came just literally I think a week and a half after the Schuyler County legislature
reversed
their
Hooray.
own, which was
maybe they watched our podcast. We talked about that.
Maybe, but I think the more likely answer is that they probably got tired of getting bombarded by the constant barrage of negativity around this project. There was no benefit to it whatsoever. There was no proven benefit to having, very minimal on the jobs impact.
Yep.
Very minimal on the natural resource impact in terms of what benefit there'd be.
Right.
Very minimal in terms of what risk would thus be created, or I should say positive benefit versus the risk. It did not add up.
Yep, it sure didn't. So hooray.
So it's done and over with. Now, my question then becomes, how will Crestwood react? Will they modify their request? Is this... I don't believe this actually kills the project, although that's what people have been saying. I think that this just throws a wrench in their plan currently.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it would be foolish of them to try to submit another permit, because if they somehow think that everybody's going to be happy and then we're all just going to forget about it, that would certainly be a miscalculation on their part. So if anything, I think this strengthens the resolve of people who were involved in that project and people who were involved in the incinerator project, and there is a lot of crossover there, just to show that, eventually the right thing will be revealed, right? It will win out in the end. So if anything, it's just made this Finger Lakes region all the more kind of enthusiastic and engaged. So
I think it was the win that some folks, particularly those involved in this fight, needed. There hasn't been a lot of change in the landfilling debate or outcome. It hasn't really been reached. There hasn't been a lot of change in the waste to energy facility. We're sort of in this holding pattern. Yep. I think it was starting to mount up, and I think a win for those folks sort of does what you're saying, re-energizes them, but I also think it gives the region a little shot of energy at the same time.
Yeah.
Are we getting closer to having a city manager in Geneva?
I don't know. I think your headline there is a little optimistic that somehow it's wrapping up. I mean, it must be. It can't go on forever, can it?
Well, we're down to 2, right? We're
apparently,
in theory, we're down to 2.
I mean, your guess is as good as mine, because apart from some highly principled people who couldn't stand to see this go down without certain things being revealed, otherwise it's been a pretty closed process. And we can see why now, right? And that's what my last column was about. Like, if you actually look at how other communities look for a city manager, it's open, they engage the public, they announce who the finalists are, the candidates, they invite people in to meet them, and they have their candidates give a presentation, like a job talk. Geneva was intent on looking at all those models and doing the exact opposite. And so I'm glad. I had no idea that Sage had put her name in, so I feel like I need to go back and say that all my statements about there not being any local candidates that could do the job was premised on the idea that the 3 current city managers, Doris, Adam, and Sage, were not interested. Because I think first thing out of the gate, I did say, if we could just keep the 3 of them, I think that would actually kind of be a perfect way to continue. But I thought the 3 of them were not applying. So, yeah, I've been of the opinion that there were no local candidates. So now that we know that there is a local candidate, it kind of doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't have appointed Sage without all of this other kind of rigmarole, because it doesn't seem to me like engaging a national search was done in such a way that they really fleshed out the best of the best in terms of going out and picking communities that are succeeding and trying to recruit their managers. So why waste time if we have someone who is really embedded in the community, understands the strategy, has been living it and has been able to bring other people into the fold and get them motivated about it and is doing a great job, then what was their argument for doing a search in the first place? Mm-hmm. I don't know. So that was an interesting piece of information, because I've been operating this entire time under the assumption that neither Sage nor Adam nor Doris were interested in the position. I just don't know what City Council's thinking. I mean, I think on every issue now, I have been unable to predict what they would do, because what they have done makes no sense and seems to undermine all of their adopted policies. And that's disappointing to me, because I kind of expected things would be a little better than that.
So last week, last Friday, I was on with Ted Baker talking about this very topic, particularly the Geneva Believers reporting on this topic, which has been incredible, thorough, and everything that it could be for the city of Geneva as far as keeping the public actually informed. It's so hard for me, the one thing that I keep getting hung up on is this idea that, and I believe we talked about it here first before anything else, the idea that someone could be shot down on the list of favorable candidates based on them being too familiar with said community.
Right.
And if that's a discouraging factor for the council to choose Sage as opposed to choosing someone else, anyone from the outside, it seems absolutely crazy to me.
Yeah.
It just makes no sense.
Well, here's why it makes sense. I mean, I'm not saying it makes good sense, but here's why it's understandable. It's understandable because this council has shown time and time again that there are a group of guys, they're all guys. So, I mean, I'm saying the people I'm talking about, there is one woman on council, but, that this group of guys on council who are kind of openly hostile to the neighborhood strategy, the comprehensive plan. They think it's all fluff. They don't see the return on investment. They're stuck in these old Rust Belt ways of thinking that what we need is just a big economic development project that will create 500 jobs and solve all our problems, when every person that they've authorized the spending of money to come in and consult with us has said is your market will not bear that, and it actually wouldn't do what you think it would do. But they're convinced they're right. So half the time they'll sit at the city council meetings and say, I'm no expert, I've got to defer to staff. But on the big issues, they believe they are the experts with no data. Like, they can't cite a study, a report, any data. They just say, I feel like this is what we need. So I believe, now that I know that Sage has been in the process, it doesn't surprise me that she was treated this way, because if you watch their interactions with her at the meetings, they don't take her or the objectives she represents, the comprehensive plan, the neighborhood strategy, seriously anyway. Or the DRI process. Like, any time the public has come forward to be engaged in what's going on, the city council, some of them, see that as an indication that something's gone wrong. Like, they're not in charge and they need to find a way to get that back. So I agree with you. It doesn't make any sense that you would disqualify somebody just because they know the community. But if you think the community's wrong, then you would discount somebody who knows the community. So that's what I think they did.
It's interesting to me, because that seems to sort of sit awfully close to this idea that you want an outsider because they won't be impacted, or essentially this is what you're saying, they won't be affected by the wrongness that they think is lingering out there. But it defies logic in the sense that the person who's coming in from the outside is going to have a learning curve, a significant one. Mm-hmm. Whereas the person who's coming from the inside, who's already there, is going to hit the ground running on day one, check off a lot of the boxes and make the community feel maybe a little better, and maybe provide a little bit of legitimacy to the whole process. So I just don't understand. It seems to be skirting so close to this area where I feel like some people could say, well, council is doing it for this principled reason. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's just gut reaction to just no thought, or just wanting someone who fits a very, very narrow view of what a city manager is.
Yes, I think you're 100% correct. I think they want what they want, and they didn't think they were going to get what they wanted if they hired Sage, so they went to this broader thing to try to find candidates that represent what they want, and we see what they want because we see who the other finalists were. Mm-hmm. If you could find people more opposite from Sage in every way, they managed that. So that shows us 2 of their 3 finalists were people that are not consistent with the values and approach and strategy that Sage represents and embodies. So you really do have a clear choice. And the fact that they didn't go with her from the get-go shows how the majority of council is leaning, and that is very concerning. So do they have a chance to get it right? Sure, they can hire Sage. I feel badly for her because I don't feel like that group is going to give up their ideas very easily. I think they're going to make it difficult for her, but she can handle it. So, at the end of the day, I think the community will win.
I guess my question or my concern is then, is there legitimacy with the position if Sage is offered and accepts? Because a lot of the conversation seems to hinge around this idea that it hasn't been a just process. It hasn't been an open process. I got to think that even with as much of a concession to the community as hiring Sage might be, I'm not sure that it erases all of that. What kind of position is she left in if she accepts and is the next city manager?
Well, I don't see hiring Sage as a concession to the community. I think all things considered, if you could have rewound the process from the beginning and engaged the residents, you would have gotten Sage or a candidate very much like her as the final candidate anyway. So I don't want to paint her appointment as a concession in any way. I think what you're seeing, I think if the process had gone the way it did and they hired one of those 2 other guys, yes, you would have had an uproar because council would have shown its hand and would have said, here's why we closed you out, here's why we did it this way, because we wanted to manipulate to get an outcome that's inconsistent with the community's vision and directives. Mm-hmm. I think the fact that their plans have been foiled, no pun intended, although that I should have said that was intended because that was a good one.
See what you did there.
But yes. But I think the fact that their strategy was exposed and that the steps were exposed, they have no choice but to correct, because I think they understand the position they've left themselves in. And hey, we're coming up on an election year, so all these people who've been hostile to Sage and the neighborhood plan, the comprehensive plan, are all of a sudden going to look like its biggest supporters just so they can get through the next election. So I think that, those guys know they got caught, and now they will, by force, I guess, of public pressure, do the right thing. But that doesn't mean they were properly motivated, and that's the problem.
It's interesting. Because I view it, and I don't mean this as an insult to Sage or to anyone else, but I feel like even if Sage is chosen, it's done as a concession. Because of all the negativity, the negative press that the Geneva City Council has experienced in the last 12 months, because of how long they've dragged this process out, because of the way they framed it, because of all of the headlines that have registered in the last 4 weeks since this process really started to get honed in on a few people, to me, I just can't feel like anything else other than just a concession to the community saying, okay, we give up, but maybe in a year or 2 we're going to say, well, told you so.
Well, that's my worry.
You know what I mean?
That is a worry. That's a good point, that you raise, because...
And it's very cynical, I get that, but it's the idea that, you're expecting this body to now all of a sudden, take this principled step and say, oh, yeah,
Right.
that's the person we wanted all along.
You're
I don't
right.
think that's the case.
You're right. And that's naive of me to think. Because that will be interesting to see. If they hire Sage and they only give her a 1 or 2 year contract, then we will know that they are just playing games, right? Because then that's their signal to their friends in the community, hey, don't worry. Once we get through this election cycle, we'll do this all over again, and we'll get one of these guys like we tried to get the last time. You know, we'll get you your lakefront development. We'll get you your economic development deals. And so that would be a problem. So, yeah, so that needs to be guarded against, because she should not be used as a pawn to try to pacify people in the short term to get these guys through the election and then let them just do what they want anyway. I think at some level they need to engage in some self-reflection and understand they've really been wrong for a long time, and it's kind of catching up with them. But unfortunately, with the tenure of some of the people that have been on council, I suppose that's unlikely. But we can hope. We can always hope for redemption.
And we'll keep talking about this until we get to some sort of concrete outcome.
Right.
Some interesting news on the news side, I guess. Penn Yan Village Justice Matthew Conlon closed court to press in 2 local high-profile cases. Weird, right? The first is a case of the Village of Penn Yan's attorney Edward Brockman, 70-year-old, who is charged with misdemeanor forcible touching for allegedly groping a teenage female client while serving as the Yates County Public Defender in February of 2016. His accuser subsequently died of a drug overdose. The second case involves a 17-year-old male charged with making terroristic threats against Penn Yan Academy as a Class D felony. He was named in a previous report, and then that was pulled because he was given youthful offender status and that sort of thing. So the courts closed to press, which is a bizarre, it just doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Especially on local cases, because these are not, they're high profile for the Village of Penn Yan, but these are not life or death type scenarios where we have a murder case or we have some sort of, vehicular homicide or DWI, something of that nature. It just doesn't seem sensible. And my concern, and the reason why I wanted to talk about this, is because this is a very good example of how easily and quietly members of the public members of the serving public can shut out the rest of the public at large. If they choose, without much pushback. So the Chronicle Express, owned by Gatehouse Media, they got their lawyers involved, went through this whole process, submitted a really eloquent, well put together letter, only to receive a pretty blunt response from Conlon himself. It says, as I'm sure you're aware, you may bring an application at any time should your client seek to draw the court's attention to an issue affecting your client's rights. You may file a motion on notice to participating counsel and schedule the matter at everyone's convenience in the court's clerk. But if you look at the rest, it's basically him saying, too bad.
Right.
You don't like it? I made a decision. Right. That's rough. And that it boggles my mind.
Yeah, I couldn't. I admit I am not very well versed in this issue. I only know the background that you had provided, but I couldn't tease out what the public interest was in keeping it closed. Like, usually if a courtroom is closed, like you said, there's some viable public reason. Like, there's something.
Safety. Yes. Safety is cited repeatedly in these different clauses as being a driving factor, whether that means like safety of the folks reporting, safety of the folks who might be there as a result of press being there, that kind of thing.
Right. So I really can't understand what the argument was, except that one line about not being pleased with the kind of coverage or the way that it was being covered in the newspaper. And I don't think you can... I mean, that does seem like a First Amendment violation to try to say, well, I don't like the way that you reported about this issue, so therefore you're not allowed in my courtroom anymore on these cases.
It would be like using Seneca Falls as an example.
I was just going to say, maybe we should use Seneca.
It would be like It would be like the town board in Seneca Falls saying the press is not allowed to cover meetings anymore because they have...
Let's not give anyone any ideas.
They have not framed it in a light that's they feel is appropriate.
Well, I mean, this does happen all the time, right? When government bodies go into executive session to talk about things that aren't legitimate executive session material, that is their way of closing the public and the press out to say, you know what? We don't like the way you talk. I mean, here's example, we'll use Geneva. When Geneva was renegotiating this firehouse that it had already purchased and then was purchasing again or whatever, there was this push to have all the communication over email, which they didn't realize is still subject to FOIL, but then B, to have all the discussions in executive session, because some of the counselors who actually agreed that this was a bad deal said, if we say that in public, that will kill our political careers. And I thought, man, you don't get how this works. You work for the public. If you think it's a bad idea for the public, you have to say that. So I think this is kind of like the executive session of the courts that you are talking about. And it shouldn't be misused in that same way to try to punish people for having an opinion or for reporting on something in a way that someone didn't like because maybe it didn't make themselves or someone they know look the way they were hoping they would.
Yeah, and I think the perception with this particular case is that it appears to be an effort to protect the reputation of Penn Yan's attorney. He is the one accused in the first case, and in the second case, I can understand. I think I can make a better case in the second circumstance involving the 17-year-old.
Yeah, if it's
for
been moved
closing
to
the
youthful
court.
offender, right? That makes more sense.
I can justify that, but there again, I think the courts have a responsibility to communicate effectively the background and the reasons and the details and actually the outcome when all is said and done, to allow the public to be informed on what happened, because it does involve public safety.
Wait, are you saying government entities should have to tell people why they are doing the things they do? What a novel concept. I mean, how many of the issues we've talked about on this show over the years could have been resolved if someone had just explained why and helped people understand how things got to be the way they did? People don't like to communicate in that way, though. I guess that's called accountability. People are allergic to that.
So that's where we stand. That's at the crux of the issue, where we are.
Yeah.
It's not really clear how that'll pan out, given the fact that my other concern is that whenever you're in a vacuum like that, where you only have one entity, one news reporting entity covering, this court case or whatever the case may be, and someone forcibly removes them from the situation, you really are creating a tough spot for the community to be in, because they are relying on that more than, in northern Seneca County, where you have 2 or 3 or 4 different news agencies reporting on any given subject.
Right.
And that, to me, is the more troubling part of it, and the impact that it has on accurate, honest reporting.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a smear campaign if it's the truth. And if it's what's happening in court in what, in theory, should be the most objective scenario imaginable, where's the harm?
Right.
But that's not all. Of course, we couldn't get through an episode without talking about Seneca Falls.
What a great segue.
So, over the last 2 or 3 weeks or so, this rent deal between the town of Seneca Falls and one of their employees has been getting under a lot of scrutiny. Former Seneca Falls Mayor Brad Jones said a town representative took it upon himself to use taxpayer funds to build a compensation package for a town employee. Jones said the action was not discussed or voted on by the board. That was verified. That employee was identified as Joe Tullo, who serves as chief wastewater treatment plant operator. He lives rent-free currently at a town-owned property off Parker Road. That's near where the wastewater treatment facility is. Previously, he had been paying $500 a month to live there, but Seneca Falls Town Supervisor Greg Lazaro waived the rent earlier this year without board knowledge. Multiple board members have since said they were surprised by the action and said that rent should be paid, but Deputy Supervisor Lou Ferrara says it's time for the town to get out of the leasing business altogether. And I got to say, that's kind of how I feel about that. Sell the house to him if that property is where he wants to live. Sell it even if it's sold at a reasonable rate because he is an employee, and even then I think you're kind of in a weird place because you have to sell it to the highest bidder kind of thing. Just don't cut your legs out from underneath you like this. This is so silly. This is like example number 510 in the last year and a half that we've been talking about Seneca Falls, where just a blatant example of failure to, one, really follow a process or procedure, and two, effectively communicate. Because if this were discussed in open session, I am willing to bet that it would have passed the board as, framed in lieu of a raise. This is your benefits increase for the year. But at the same time, sort of speaks to the uncertainty and the confusion around things that are managed by the town of Seneca Falls, which frankly seem to just lack management. Period. You got a bunch of things happening. You got a multi-million-dollar budget. You have all of these employees. You have all of these different things being managed by essentially a different person every day. Different people are making decisions on a daily basis, and nothing is being done with any sort of regularity. It's wild.
Yeah, I think this goes back to our initial conversation about the audit, that there are irregularities that might be examined in the way that Seneca Falls does business. What's interesting to me, though, is that this deal, I think, happened after Seneca Falls moved to its new full-time counsel, who I believe has some real estate law experience. So it seems strange to me that there would be a rental agreement of this sort that wouldn't be caught as something that the board has to approve, or an official document needs to be registered and executed for that. So it makes me wonder how Seneca Falls is feeling about that switch, because you would hope things would improve with such a switch. But I think that, again, you covered it, right? This, in the grand scheme of things, probably would have been a simple resolution, a quick discussion, and approval. And then they could have had a bigger discussion about how they got this house and whether they want to keep it and how they want to dispose of it or whatever. That is how government would work. But we have people in government, and sometimes people think, rules, schmools, I'm going to do what I'd like because I can. And that's when we get into trouble. So that, and then you end up with like this kind of unsuspecting employee who's kind of had this arrangement and has been paying rent, gets offered this. And is it his responsibility to make sure that the town board has checked it out and offered this in good faith? Or does he think that the supervisor is speaking on behalf of the board and is authorized to do this? I just think it ends up impugning somebody who has nothing to do with the town board, in terms of their own deliberative process, and makes it look like he's trying to get away with something when, really, that's not the case.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think that the big problem here is that you just have a lot of moving parts and a lot of, just a lack of policy and a lack of procedure. And I think the really interesting thing is that before this headline made its way to the Finger Lakes Times, I think a lot of people were even surprised that the town of Seneca Falls had some sort of rental agreement with a town employee. Because regardless of the circumstances, you can go pretty much you can search on Craigslist, you can search on any number of, if you're looking for a rental unit, and you can look at the prices. I think that you'd be a little surprised that, one, Seneca Falls is doing it, but also that they're giving it away at $500 per month. There aren't a lot of rental units, especially those that are entire houses, on the market in general for $500 a month. And who's eligible to live there? Can it exclusively be one person? It just creates a lot of gray area for a community that doesn't have any systems or procedures in place. And it was a recipe for disaster all along. And then you throw in the added bonus, I guess.
I think reading this audit is going to be a lot of fun.
And the belief is that the audit was winding down, and this sort of opened up a new avenue for the auditors to sort of quickly re-examine.
Right.
Now, whether that examination is over or whether it's still going on, totally unclear, but I think from some of the folks we've talked to behind the scenes, it seems as though things were almost done, and then this item popped up, and all of a sudden, here we are again. More questions, more interviews.
Well, kudos to Brad Jones for paying attention to what's going on and staying engaged, because that's the thing. There are people in each community who have a kind of collective wisdom over time who've been involved with certain aspects. And the more engaged people are in the community, the quicker you can catch something like this and try to remedy it.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump back into our topics of the week, or our story of the week. Has there been anything that you've been following over the last few weeks that's caught your eye and that people should be paying attention to, because we need more engagement, right?
Well, I think my story of the past couple weeks has been a story about a story. So the Finger Lakes Times ran a story about the city manager search, and they cited as their source Jim Meany's Geneva Believer blog. And to me, that is a very important story within the story, right? So set the content of the city manager search aside and just look at the fact that the local newspaper first essentially got scooped by the blog, right? But that's fine. But then was able to refer to the blog in doing their own reporting. And I think that was a huge boost to this kind of community information sharing, right? Because some people on council, I think, have tried to minimize the blog the same way they did when Chip Caprero and I used to have a blog, as, just airing dirty laundry or just something on the periphery that people shouldn't pay attention to. When really, this kind of citizen activism is what is driving information sharing. And it is, it's worth the Finger Lakes Times taking note of the fact that this is a legitimate effort. This is a legitimate part of the information landscape. So, I don't know, I just thought that was good. I think it encourages everybody to read the blog, to engage with the blog, to read the paper, to watch our podcast, right? To be paying attention to the many voices that are getting information and helping to shape these stories.
And I think that lends itself to the outdated idea that if it isn't sourced from your newsroom, it's not real, or it can't be trusted.
Right.
And I think we're now finally getting to a place where we've been doing it here at Finger Lakes One for years, where we will quote any source from any newsroom, because you have to be working off the assumption that everyone is trying to reach this basic level of integrity in the business.
Right.
I mean, following the opposite method sends this message of, well, we don't trust them, they don't follow the right protocols and procedures. That's ludicrous. Everybody gets news. In 2018, everybody gets news the exact same way. Most likely it comes from a device first before it comes from a face-to-face interaction. And I think it's a big step for, obviously, the blog and for Geneva, but at the same time, I think it's a really big step for the news industry as a whole to see some of these big old-school players in the business start to take... the Geneva Believer is the Finger Lakes Times competition, and taking them seriously, I think, is very important. because they are doing hyper local coverage and news in a way that it is very difficult for a traditional outlet to do because of the resources that have to be spent doing it.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a compliment rather than a competition because, essentially, Geneva Believer is filling the niche that a larger newsroom with more reporters would have already been doing, asking those questions, getting that follow-up, getting those sources. And I just think it's good. I think it's good for the region that this is happening.
So my story to watch for the next couple weeks, and the one that I've been watching for the last couple, involves former Emergency Management Director Melissa Taylor here in Seneca County. She resigned after an investigation was launched. A lot of questions about the investigation. County Manager John Shepard led that investigation. The investigation concluded. She resigned. Now she's actually seeking reinstatement by the Board of Supervisors to be placed under their supervision rather than the county manager's supervision. So many different ways this story can play out over the next several weeks and through this next decision cycle for the supervisors, for the Board of Supervisors. Definitely worth watching, really interesting, and I think in a lot of ways can be informative of how government actually works. Like, this is one of those situations where you can learn a lot about how decisions are made in government by just following this story along and seeing where the sort of decision tree goes up and branches out and turns here and goes there.
Right.
Really important stuff, and I think something that we'll be talking about more on our next podcast when more information is publicly divulged. But that's it. We got through it. We got through this. Obviously, send us your questions. Drop us a line at debrief@fingerlakes1.com. We'd like to thank our listeners and, of course, fingerlakes1.com for making this podcast possible. For Jackie Augustine, I'm Josh Durso. Stay informed, Finger Lakes, and we will catch you next time.